our society, or movies reflecting certain themes in the culture and the culture reflecting them back as we go through the different decades
surprisingly,
of films?
I would say surprisingly little has changed thematically since the days of Georges Méliès, who invented special effects. And then if you, like, for example, if you look at a silent film like Metropolis, you can see in that Fritz Lang film all the same themes are there that are being reworked that have been being reworked, let's say since 1968 when Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey came out, which is basically a reworking of the same theme. Again, the individual versus the machine. And the major theme in Metropolis, there's a political, communist, socialist subtext, but beyond that there is also the interface between the human being and the machine. And and Fritz Lang, all through his work, you find all these same themes. He went back and reworked Wagnerian mythology, gave it a new twist.
Right, and the Dr. Mabuse films.
Yeah, just as a sort of rehearsal for Star Wars almost. And Star Wars, in many ways, is a kind of is a good example too, because Star Wars reworks the Wagnerian themes, whether consciously or not. It's the same set of archetypes, except done through a more highly technologized electronic technology in particular, because it was electronic technology that took off after World War II, and that's sort of the new layer, the new sediment that's been added on top of technological history, and that has become the difficult thing now for the human psyche to adjust to and deal with. So there have been these layers that have been added onto technology, but the themes are still basically the same that you find in Metropolis and in Georges Méliès's Trip to the Moon, for example. It could be said that 2001: A Space Odyssey goes back to the birth of cinema and reworks Méliès's Trip to the Moon. It's basically the same story.
2001 was really, I think, for motion pictures as a whole, a leap in the way that people were able to gather information from watching a film, and it sort of started, I think, crystallized what I would call a forward-thinking cinema language. It was very metaphoric, very visual. You were left to kind of free associate the metaphoric and symbolic aspects of the film, and everyone had their own specific interpretation, whether it was, an alchemical one or it was something that the basic ape to man kind of a thing, and where are we going in the future, and also at the end with the Star Child, we're left with the question mark of who are we really, and is there a connection between us and other beings out there in the stars. As you mentioned in your book and you mentioned on your site, that it was sort of a landing point for Hollywood to say, there's really something about this aspect of mythology in films. And did you find that at that point in the 60s that there was a kind of re-examination of Hollywood, and they started using the mythological structure more predominantly in the way that films are actually produced?
Yeah, and the way I see it is that Stanley Kubrick was the pioneer here. He was the first guy who came in, and we use the word Hollywood, but really, when we step back from and look at these filmmakers, Kubrick and Lucas, these are guys who have always had a very skewed relationship with Hollywood. They distrust it and they don't like it, and they've had to use it as a primary means because they had to get the films made. And, it was one of the reasons why Kubrick left for England and decided to live there and spend his life there rather than in Hollywood. But being outsiders, as it were, to Hollywood, Kubrick was the first to read Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces and use that as the basic structure for writing a screenplay. And then he gave the book to Arthur C. Clarke, and he said, read this book while you're writing the screenplay, and we'll bat these ideas around, and this might give us some sense of how we might structure this thing. And so, indeed, what we have in 2001: A Space Odyssey is the hero's journey. The hero here, unusually, is actually humanity itself. That's the protagonist of the film rather than a single character. And it tells the birth of the human consciousness emerging as the result of a fascination, first, note, not with a tool, but with a spiritual experience. That monolith appears, and the sort of anthropoid apes are gathered around it, and they don't know what to make of it, and that becomes a sort of metaphor for the birth of religious awe, the transformation that liberates the spiritual man out of the animal man and begins the process. Then, when that expansion of consciousness has taken place, then the tool comes along, and he's able to use the tool then to begin building a habitation for culture. And then what happens is, so humanity is born out of the animal, so we have this animal birth, and then technology builds civilization, and there's a fall. So the human spirit becomes captured, like in the old Gnostic myths, where the basic mythology of Gnosticism is that the spirit being comes down from the heavens, sees its reflection in the material realm, falls in love with it, descends into it, and becomes captured, caught, and incarnated in the material realm. So that the basic idea of Gnosticism is, you've forgotten your divine origins, and you want to remember what those heavenly origins were through the process of gnosis, knowing. And in doing so, it reconnects you back to our properly spiritual dimension that incarnation in a physical body has made us forget. So in this case, it's the fall not so much just into the material body, it's the human fall into technology. Technology has enabled humanity to build civilization as an exoskeleton, as it were, to protect itself from the elements and from nature and from chaos. And but the problem is that with the acceleration of technology in Western Faustian civilization since the Industrial Revolution, technology has become more and more of a prison, something that has completely taken over the arts and sciences and humanities, mostly pushed the humanities out. And the psyche has had to adapt very rapidly, more rapidly than ever before in the history of humanity, to a lot of changes that have taken place just in the past 100 years. And the psyche responds to these things. It's not this inert entity that's just sort of happily goes along with what the conscious attitude thinks about, how great you think your new stereo is or driving your car. The deep psyche can very often be at odds with this environment. And we know that because these stories that are told, whether it's in novels, it could be in film, or comic books, tell us stories that act as a sort of X-ray down into the deep psyche and tells us what the real psyche thinks about these transformations. And what it thinks is that, from what I found with these films that have been made since 2001, in 2001, the ending makes the classic statement in The Battle with Hal, the machine there, is that our psyche is having nightmares about its machines. It is in no way comfortable with them the way we consciously think we are. And so it spins out these scenarios like in the James Cameron's Terminator films of homicidal robots that have decided to eliminate humanity. That's a metaphoric way of the psyche saying that it feels like it's under assault here by having to adapt to all these new types of technological innovations that have thrown its sense ratios off kilter and out of balance. And so it feels threatened, and it expresses that sense of threat through these metaphoric stories. And so that's what we're getting when we go to see these movies that we think are just popcorn entertainment. They're really not. They're messages from deep down.
You have on your website, there's a couple of recent films. You talk about Batman and Beowulf and Iron Man and some of the other motion pictures that have come out recently. Let's just jump into one particular movie because it was so popular this year, which was The Dark Knight. That film was just so full of mythological weavings all throughout that, and the response of people. And I was actually I went to see it a couple of times in the theaters, and I'd watch and kind of sense people's reaction. And, Batman himself as the Dark Knight is sort of this dark force, which is, at one point, he's trying to protect society, but in another aspect, he's sort of rebelling against the system. So he finds himself in a really interesting, dilemma as how does he do what he feels compelled to do to right wrongs, but at the same time, he's an outcast. I think that people identify with that because they have to be in society, but at the same time they feel that so much is wrong that they want to distance themselves from it and rebel against it and cause revolution. So here we have this Joker who is a completely random element, a violent random element in society, and that's sort of the aspect of society that people feel that they can't control. Like today we have gangs and who roam cities and things like that. So talk a little bit about, from your perspective, about the whole Batman myth and why you feel that at this time it has become so popular again.
Sure, and that's a wonderful film, by the way. I think that's the best of the Batman movies so far. The basic aspect of this is that if you go back to the beginnings of the birth of the comic book superhero, starting with Superman and Batman, who are more or less the first two. I mean, there are forerunners, the Phantom and so forth. Mm-hmm. But those are the first two to crystallize with their own comic books, and separate, independent from the newspapers. And they're interesting because Batman emerges as this kind of figure who is modeled on, in his conscious aspect, he's modeled on Sherlock Holmes. Bruce Wayne, he dresses in these early comic books.
Like Sherlock Holmes and Zorro kind of combined.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he has the sidekick, and he's sort of the crime solver. But the dark aspect of him, when he puts on the suit, actually evokes Native American mythology, which is a totally new element here in comics. The Bat God is a very well-known Native American mythic character, and you can even see there's a carving from the site of Monte Alban of the Batman, and it looks exactly like the comic book character. It's just a head, and I think it's carved out of jade or something like that. And it's the Bat God man. And